Please leave a comment where you are watching in the world. Please support us by visiting our new Patreon channel. Link in the description. Enjoy. My dad and stepmom's wedding was a complete shitshow from start to finish. For some context, her family was a toxic cocktail of dysfunction. On one side, she had an abusive father who seemed to thrive on making her life miserable. On the other, a neglectful, alcoholic mother who could barely care for herself, let alone her kids. Add in step-parents who treated her more like a nuisance than a daughter, and you get the picture. By the time she was 15, she ran straight into the arms of my dad, hoping for some kind of refuge. But here's the kicker. My dad was 26 at the time, already an abusive disaster of a human being, and hardly anyone's idea of a savior. To make matters worse, my dad's own baggage could fill a fleet of cargo planes. He despised his mother and blamed her for everything wrong in his life. Scratch that, he blamed most women in his life for everything wrong, period. This charming tendency would eventually extend to my stepmom, of course. Given all this, it was no surprise that their wedding was destined to be an absolute train wreck. It started with my stepmom walking down the aisle. She'd reconnected with her biological father in the past year. Because why not rekindle a relationship with your abuser right before the biggest day of your life? Her stepdad, meanwhile, was out of the picture after a recent fight, so it was her father who had the dubious honor of giving her away. The ceremony was outdoors, which sounds picturesque until you factor in the reality of uneven terrain and low-hanging branches. As they walked together, he reached out to pull a branch out of her way. A rare act of fatherly kindness, perhaps? Nope. He held it just long enough for her to walk under, then let it snap back right into her face. He collapsed in hysterics. Not a little chuckle or an awkward laugh. No, he full-on keeled over, wheezing like he'd just heard the funniest joke in the world. My stepmom, clearly mortified, let out a weak, forced chuckle because, let's face it, she knew the drill. If she reacted like a normal human being, he'd get pissed. So she plastered on a fake smile and soldiered on, visibly upset but determined not to cause a scene. The ceremony itself was short and awkward, filled with the kind of tension you could cut with a knife. But things really started to unravel at the reception. After the toasts, some guests didn't drink the champagne that had been set out for the occasion. My stepmom had made one request to her mother for the day: don't drink. Not one drop. To make it easier, she'd even arranged for her mom to have sparkling juice instead of champagne. Of course, that didn't stop her mom. While my stepmom was off changing into her reception dress, her mother went table to table, pounding back any unattended alcohol she could find. At one point, a clueless cousin of mine, oblivious to the whole situation, noticed what she was doing and started chanting, "Chug, chug, chug," like we were at a college frat party. Encouraged, her mom doubled down, guzzling what must have been her 5th or 6th glass. Right as my stepmom returned, glowing in her new dress, she caught sight of her mom downing yet another glass and then, incredibly, denying everything. My cousin, suddenly realizing he'd walked into a landmine, slinked away while stepmom and her mom got into a heated argument. Voices were raised, accusations were flung, and eventually my stepmom stormed off in tears. She locked herself in her car for a good 20 minutes, while the rest of the guests awkwardly pretended nothing was happening. Meanwhile, my dad's side of the family was adding their own special brand of chaos. My grandma showed up late, which would have been fine if she'd just quietly taken a seat. But no, she pulled up with all the grace of a Category 5 hurricane, immediately launching into a tirade against my dad. Her list of grievances was long and varied: marrying a child, never mind that my stepmom was 25 by then, not letting her invite some random friend to the wedding, and owing her money, lots of it. My dad, not exactly known for his patience or diplomacy, responded in the only way he knew how, by telling her to fuck off. Loudly. Grandma, not one to back down, hurled a few more insults before finally leaving, muttering expletives under her breath as she stomped away. By the time my stepmom returned to the reception, she was doing her best to hold it together. But my dad, in true form, couldn't leave well enough alone. Instead of comforting her or, I don't know, being a decent husband for once, he accused her of being a baby for crying. And if that wasn't bad enough, he added another layer of absurdity by accusing her of sneaking off to cheat on him during those 20 minutes she'd spent crying in the car. You can't make this stuff up. For the rest of the night, my stepmom sat on the fringes of the reception, trying not to cry while also making sure to stay in my dad's line of sight. It was a delicate balancing act. Show no emotion, but also don't disappear again, lest he invent another ridiculous accusation. The cherry on top of this dumpster fire of a day. The marriage, despite its 10-year lead-up, lasted a grand total of 6 months. 6 months of misery, blame, and dysfunction before my stepmom finally called it quits. Honestly, it's a miracle it lasted that long. So that's the story of my dad and stepmom's wedding. A shit show of epic proportions, brought to you by a cast of deeply flawed individuals who couldn't go 5 minutes without turning someone else's happiness into their personal battleground. You'd think weddings are supposed to be a celebration of love and unity, but for my family, it was just another opportunity to remind everyone how dysfunctional we truly are. I was a wedding butler for 2 years and have worked a little over 100 weddings, and these are some of my favorite stories. To preface this, for those that don't know what a wedding butler is, my job entailed setting up / maintaining / cleaning and taking down weddings, as well as catering to people's needs regardless of what they were aside from food and drink. And if it was ever needed, which was a few times, I was also security. The most awkward wedding I ever worked started out like any other wedding. Roughly 120 people, nice couple. Wedding was to take place outside, and the reception was to take place in a large refurbished barn. Everything goes smoothly till it was time for the speeches. At this point in the night, I usually slip away to a somewhat secluded part of the reception to eat and listen in case anything goes wrong, but still close enough that people could find me. Well, the best man comes up to give his speech, and by this point in the evening, he was already pretty hammered. It starts out normal, him talking about how he introduced the bride to the groom, and day they first met, and whatnot. Everything seemed normal. Granted, he would go on and on about the bride at times, but hey, some people are like that, so I mostly ignored him till I hear him end his speech with how it should have been him, and how he still loves her. As soon as he said that, everyone went silent, and it got really awkward. Someone eventually ushered him off stage, and the only reason I didn't help was because I was doubled over trying not to burst out laughing. Unlike the first story, the worst wedding we ever had did not start out like most weddings. It started out bad, and just got steadily worse. So 4 weeks prior to the wedding, the bride apparently fell down a flight of stairs and shattered her leg to the point she needed someone to help her walk down the aisle and stand at the altar. Prior to the ceremony, though at the rehearsal dinner of the 80 people scheduled to show up, about 40 actually did, which would sort of make sense if they lived across country or overseas or something, but everyone at the wedding lived under 5 hours from the site. Add to this fact the catering company for the evening brought the wrong order, and there wasn't even enough food for the people there. And to top it off, the bride and groom had hired a somewhat well-known bluegrass band to come play at the rehearsal dinner, and they never showed up. Now that's just the start of it. During the ceremony itself, it hailed the entire time and ended just as the ceremony did. Now it was a rather windy and chilly day, and usually the bride and groom spend a good 1.5 hours or so taking pictures around the property because of how scenic it is, but they asked me to cut it short so they could go to the tent reception and finally relax. Well, I was driving them around on this little limo golf cart thing, and the bride and groom jump in the back, and the maid of honor is there with them, but no one noticed that the bride's gown was hanging precariously close to the back wheel. So I start the cart up, throw it into reverse, make sure everyone is won and settled, and as soon as I turn around and start to drive backwards, I watch as the bride gets pulled off the cart, and I ended up running over her other leg. I immediately stopped the cart, jumped off, and tended to her, but before I could help her up, she shoots up and loses it at the groom and maid of honor for not helping her, and she apologized to me what happened, and I was so stunned I had no clue what to say. I'm very used to dealing with angry people at weddings, especially inebriated ones, but almost all the time they are angry at me or one of the other staff. Anyway, she calms down, and I take them all to the reception that is already going downhill and fast. So while I was away, the catering company arrived and started setting up food when they realized they brought the wrong order again. And while they had enough food for everyone, the only thing to eat at the wedding was grilled cheese and dessert. Not only that, but a separate company was hired to bartend for the wedding and didn't realize the event would be taking place outside, and so they didn't bring enough water for the reception and very quickly had to start cutting people off. The reception continues, they have the speeches, the band actually showed up this time, and everything was going fine till this one guest got super wasted, and as she was carrying a full glass of red wine back to her table, she tripped and dozes the bride. This abruptly ends the reception as the bride has the groom help her storm off, and everyone slowly leaves about an hour before they were supposed to end. Those are just a couple of stories of many that I have, and if you want I will write more later. I hope you all enjoy, and I'm sorry for how long they are, and if they are worded weirdly, I'm better at oral storytelling rather than written. My time has come. Good friends getting married. It was a medium-sized wedding, no more than 75 people, including the bridal party and groomsmen. The bride's sister-in-law is pissed off something mighty. It was a wedding and reception by a lake, and everyone knew the venue, so we dressed accordingly, shirts and comfortable trousers, sundresses and sandals, etc. Sister-in-law is dressed like she's heading out for an evening of dinner and dancing. Sky-high heels, tight dress, rhinestones everywhere. She looks gorgeous, but it's not comfortable, and we're outside. The ceremony is sweet, except for the words fucking bugs, fucking pine needles, goddamn dirt. That's being picked up from the small, yet apparently mighty, microphone up front. Right after the ceremony, we walk over to the gazebo/picnic area where the reception will be, and the sister-in-law starts lobbing her high heels at her husband, screeching about what an awful day it is, gashes her husband's eyebrow open. While people are scrambling to get him napkins because facial wounds bleed like a motherfucker, and try to get him into a car to drive him to the hospital for stitches, she decides to up the ante. She says, "I can't take this anymore," and throws herself off of the dock in a dramatic swan dive. The problem is, the lake at that point was only 4 feet deep and marshy, so instead of a suicide, she just sort of bobs along in the water because everyone's more concerned with her husband's eye/face. Sister-in-law's father just turns towards the lake, tells her to get her ass out of there and cut the shit. They pile into 2 cars and drove off. It was surreal. I've catered many weddings, and there have been some memorable ones. Fights between guests, wedding cakes falling over, red wine spilt on wedding dresses. The lot. The one I'll never forget. An all-day small ceremony, a few close friends and family, and a big reception filled with a huge buffet, every type of food you could imagine, and a free bar. All in the same venue. They had booked and paid for 250 evening guests. But 30 guests turned up at most. My heart broke for this couple. A massive, beautiful converted barn, loads of food and drinks, great music, but no guests. At about 10 p.m., the venue was licensed until 11 p.m. The buffet food had barely been touched. The few who were there ate, but it hardly made a dent as it was planned for so many more people. I asked the mother of the bride if she wanted me to cover and refrigerate the untouched food, so the new couple could take it home, and her response of "oh no, there are still a lot of people coming," was the most awkward I've ever felt in my life. No more guests showed. There was a flash of car headlights in the distance about 10:30 p.m., and the bride beamed when she thought it was late comers arriving. But no, it was just taxis arriving to pick up the few who were there. It's the only event I have ever done where we didn't have to kick people out of the venue. At 11 p.m., the place was empty. In a nutshell, bride's parents paid for the day, and the happy couple had zero control over their guest list. Her parents invited all their friends to the evening function, but in reality, it was just associates they wanted to flex on, resulting in no one giving a shit about an invite to a wedding where they didn't know the bride or groom. It was basically just a networking event for the bride's parents. For those asking, I believe the guests did RSVP. But instead of a handful of guests thinking, "fuck it, we don't know them, they won't notice we're not there," it was the majority of them. My husband and I were invited to the wedding of a military buddy of his. We were running a little late, but weren't too worried. We got onto base and headed for the main chapel. There are 3 or 4 chapels on base. When we got to the main chapel, it was apparent that there was no wedding going on. Looked at the invitation again. It just said post-chapel and gave an address. So obviously, this wasn't the post-chapel that the bride had intended, and I whipped out my phone to look up the address. We drove to that part of the base and found the place. It was some sort of administration building, definitely not a chapel. We were confused, but we found a building with chaplain's office on the directory, so we figured we'd been invited to some sort of civil ceremony. The building was locked. Now thoroughly confused and late at this point. As we were wondering what we should do, we see an older gentleman in a tuxedo wandering around. He's pretty clearly in the same boat. Turns out he's the groom's father, and he doesn't have any more idea what's going on than we do. After a few more minutes, a soldier arrives. He's the chaplain's assistant, and he's looking for lost wedding guests, namely the groom's father. Turns out the bride put down the wrong address and the wrong chapel name on the invitation. By the time we got to the wedding, which they had delayed because the groom's dad was missing. The bride was in tears. I felt so bad for her. They finally started the wedding, and the chaplain gave an awkward sermon about being clothed in Jesus' love and lost his place several times. Finally, as the ceremony was over and the guests began to applaud, a bat fell down out of the ceiling and died. Craziest wedding I'd ever been to. I work as an event planner. It was the wedding of two fairly wealthy families, and the bride had decided on a rather rural, shabby chic aesthetic. The reception, she decided, would take place on family property in a historic barn. This caused a huge flurry of issues, between having to have the barn cleaned, the fact that we needed auxiliary tents as the barn wasn't large enough, and the fact that the property lacked electricity and running water. The latter was solved with a bank of generators, tubs of water for catering, and a side tent with porta-johns hidden inside. The bride had, to be honest, been quite a bridezilla, but it's my job to deal with those things. At this point, the ceremony had ended, cocktail hour is shutting down, professional photos were taken. We were prepping to transition to the entrance of the bridal party, which would be followed immediately by first dance and cake cutting. During this, the dinner would be staged, so every aspect was being fairly carefully timed out. I was speaking to the caterer when I happened to glance over and see the most curious blend of expressions pass over bride's face, and she frantically waved down my assistant. A few moments later, my headset beeped on, and my assistant said, "We have an issue." It turns out that the bride had gambled on a fart and lost in a big way. Now the bride was wearing a huge full ball gown with a fitted, bone strapless top in a sort of embellished mesh. Underneath, she had a shaper garment and hoops and slips. We had already realized there was zero way of her going to the bathroom. We had issues getting her into a limo, and having her use a porta-johns meant one of us would have to get personal. That was my assistant's job. I radioed to everyone to expect a 15-minute delay, and they headed towards the tent. The 15 minutes pass, then 20. Finally, my earpiece beeps on. The previous issue is more than we anticipated. I ran over to find my assistant looking horrified. The bride, it turns out, had been using some health shakes in an attempt to fix last-minute bloating. This had mixed poorly with the cocktails from earlier, and she had eaten a fairly decent breakfast. The substance that had come out of her body as a result defied explanation. It was slimy, oily even, with stringy bits and the consistency of hair gel. Not only had it been a rather profound accident, but the smell was unrivaled. Generally, a substance no human body should emit. But the thing that set it over the edge was that the shaper the bride wore was a latex deal that came down over the thighs and up to her bra. Waterproof, the poo had just sort of filled it, like a water balloon of horror. My assistant had opened up the snap crotch and just released the evil trickling down the bride's thighs. My assistant quickly sealed it back up, and she and the bride vainly tried to wipe up the goo, dry with toilet paper. This just spread it around, so they decided to give up. Now I have a shell-shocked assistant and a crying bride. You can smell her 4 feet away. The bride is just flipping out that she's making her guests wait, that she has a choreographed dance waiting to happen, and she needs to be introduced now. I'm just looking at her manicured nails. Residue of diarrhea are just embedded in her nail bed. I start trying to scrape the poo out with a fabric stain wipe, while the bride insists that the show must go on immediately. I give in that this is an issue which will have to wait, and signal to start introductions. The groom looks vaguely disconcerted by his new wife's odor, but I tell my assistant to distract him until they take the floor. Introductions happen, the dance starts, and we find some fresh horror. The dance was a choreographed affair, and as the groom spun his bride around, hand on her waist, he is squishing the poo up the insides of the waist trainer, up and out the back waistband. To our horror, we watch as a oily stain spread across the mid-back of the gown. As we are still cringing from this, the groom sets his hand firmly in the middle of the poo stain. Action had to be taken as soon as the couple left the dance floor. It was obvious, and I left my assistant in charge while I made preparations. She kept radioing me. The stain was spreading. She could smell the poo from her spot by the DJ. They were cutting the cake now. They were feeding the cake to each other, both now with shit-stained fingers. Each was looking downright repulsed. As they left the dance floor, I had someone rush wet naps to the groom, and to bring me the bride. The support tent was closed down for me, and I pulled a tub of clean water from the caterers. She walked in to find me in dish gloves and a poncho, like American Psycho. The 5 minutes, I was sponging down a sobbing, naked bride, while I questioned every life decision that led to this point. The diarrhea was everywhere, spread in a thin layer across her body. It may be the most disgusting thing I've ever dealt with. With her clean, I threw away the waist shaper and scrubbed down the $15,000 wedding gown back in a plastic basin. The inner lining was a loss, and I cut it out completely. Dressed again and offered a Xanax, the bride was little worse for wear, except for missing her dinner. The support tent smelled like a sewer and just was closed for the remainder of the event. The groom was a sport, never directly saying anything, but asking if we could cancel the garter toss as he didn't really want to go under her skirt. I didn't attend, but I worked at one that was a disaster. It was many years ago when I was a barman in an Irish hotel. The hotel was struggling, and so took a wedding booking from a well-known criminal family, involved in drugs and burglary. Their daughter was marrying a member of a similar family from the other side of the country. These families were very large, so the wedding was huge. The bride has asked us not to serve vodka, which was making people pretty angry as they were all in for the vodka and Red Bull. Most switched to cider, and we'd an entire shed full of the stuff. About 2 hours into the reception, shit hit the fan. The first sign something was wrong was that all the women suddenly made a beeline for the door. Thankfully, one of the floor managers had seen this before and pulled the waitresses out the moment she saw it. Once the women were clear of the floor, the men started laying into one another. I saw a bottle fly past, and we pulled the shutter down over the bar. It was the biggest brawl I've ever seen, easily 50 men pucking the heads off one another. Someone drove a car into our emergency exit. Chairs went through windows. The fight spilled out to the rest of the hotel, while the staff were locked behind the bar or in the kitchen. We called the Gardaí, but they took their time coming as they obviously didn't want to get into the middle of a massive brawl, and were happy to let them tire each other out. We didn't have enough security to make any difference, as the owners were morons and couldn't afford it anyway. Finally, when it was over, we had to comp every other guest. We had a shed still full of cider, which we essentially had to do 3 for 2 offers on for months. We spent the rest of that night, until about 4 in the morning, cleaning up blood. I've never seen so much fucking blood before or since. And glass and human shit. The place never recovered. We had to cancel the next 3 weddings due to the damage, and once word got around we couldn't get any more. Locals avoided the place. It was sold 6 months later at a huge loss. Wedding was at a Napa Valley winery during the tech boom of the 90s. Groom, frat boyish VC funder on the climb. Bride blonde, brittle, glossy. Both prone to using marketing/tech speak in conversation. Let's right-click on that and drill down. It's not an IRL shop, more of a clicks and mortar thing, etc. The wedding invitation was in the form of a merger announcement in a mocked-up Wall Street Journal page. As in, Smith Global announces merger with Jones Limited. Combination delivers significant potential to drive long-term affection growth and market share of love. That kind of thing. Still, the guy was a friend, and my date and I went to show our support. The first really weird thing that happened. The bride's twin brother came out before the wedding, got the bride to perch on a stool in front of everyone, and serenaded her, on his knees, with a guitar. He wrote the song. It was a love ballad with such barely concealed incestuous longing that everyone was frozen with discomfort. He sang of how beautiful his sister was, how any man would be lucky to have her. I can't remember the whole thing, but this lyric seared itself into my brain, lips touching, tongues dancing. They give each other the look that can mean just one thigh-eyeing. It was not done for laughs. He was crying as he sang, and everyone watching looked like they wanted to drop through the floor. Then the wedding. 2 sets of chairs set up in a lovely courtyard garden, aisle down the middle leading to a bower. We all seated ourselves on the chairs, which had white upholstery. The ceremony itself wasn't that bad. My date and I thought things might be picking up. It didn't last too long, and there were no more lurid songs from Bride's bro. But then it ended, and the minister said, "And now, I ask each of you to reach under your chairs for the small, white envelope you will find there. Each one contains a live monarch butterfly. We will release them into the air and let them soar free, as a symbol of the love these two have for each other." Everyone froze. Whoever had set up the area had put the envelopes on, not under, the chairs. White envelopes. Little white envelopes on snow-white chair seats. Open-mouthed with horror, all the guests reached down and found the envelopes. We opened them. Most were dead, squashed into bloody smears. But a good amount were just horribly maimed, these poor butterflies that had been sat on for the better part of 45 minutes. We watched in shock as these broken-assed, mangled butterflies, missing a wing or some legs or a tail, flopped onto the ground and twitched out their death agonies. Moral: no incest. No live butterflies. That is all. The main question seemed to be, are they still married? Answer: I don't know. We weren't great friends to begin with, and then something happened that made us not be friends anymore at all, which is a whole nother story that involves no incest or mangled half-dead butterflies. How the hell does anyone just SIT on a little white envelope? Answer: most folks at the wedding probably did what I did, i.e. walked to chair, see little white envelope. Pick it up. It had something written on the front like, to be opened after ceremony. So, I tossed it back on the chair and sat on it. Better than holding it for the duration, and it probably had a little card or something, right? Certainly didn't expect it to contain something alive and crushable. And I didn't just toss mine under the chair because it was dirt/grass, and it seemed wrong to do that. Others just sat down and didn't see anything, they told me. I bet all of us check what we're sitting on way more carefully now. Is there video of the wedding? Answer: yes, but I don't have one. See above not friends anymore. We weren't close enough to rate getting a copy at the time. But I'm thinking I might try to find this guy online, see if they're still married, just to satisfy curiosity. We'll report back if I find anything, especially if it's hilarious and or horrifying. Bride and groom get shit-faced, get into fight, crying, yelling, screaming, running out into the courtyard. Best man goes to check on them, finds them rolling on the ground, not in a sexy way. Best man throws bride out of the way, slams groom's head into the sidewalk, and pins him down. Bride starts kicking groom in the face. Best man pushes her away, while sitting on top of groom. Bride storms off with bride's maid. Best man lets groom up, who begins kicking and punching trees and breaking the posts off a gazebo, saying, "I'm gonna kill myself." Best man tells bride's maid to go grab the police officer from inside for assistance. Police officer comes out and tries to help get groom to his room. Wedding was at a fancy hotel. Groom proceeds to talk shit and be disrespectful with the officer and ends up getting arrested. Father of groom disowns him, yells at bride. Best man and his date end up taking care of bride and groom's child and staying in their honeymoon suite for the night. Source: I was the best man. I'll explain the slams head into sidewalk part. The groom was on his back on the ground, and the bride was on top of him. He's basically giving her a bear hug, while she's screaming and flailing. So as I come around the corner, all I see is a man holding a screaming woman, rolling around on the ground. I'm completely startled by what I'm seeing. Also, mind you, it's dark out there. So when I threw her off of him, I was straddling his chest, and I put my palm on his forehead and pushed it to the sidewalk, maybe 3 inches. Just a quick reset button. I literally immediately said, "I'm sorry I hit you. Are you okay, man?" He replied, "It's okay, I'm okay," all while still holding him. Y'all are acting like I picked him up and dumped him straight on his head from 4 feet in the air, lol. I was not trying to hurt him, or her for that matter. I was simply trying to end their physical confrontation. Hence why I stayed on top of him, tried to stop the kicks, and pushed her away when she came back for more, and told her to leave, which is when we stormed off with the bride's maid. That was the de-escalation period. I wasn't holding him down so she could kick him. Now take my word for it or not, this guy would never hit her, which is why I was so startled in the first place. Come to find out, the groom was bear hugging her like that to prevent her from hitting him in the face anymore. And they were on the ground because they were both hammered and tripped while she was hitting him. After I let him up, he was basically realizing all the crazy bullshit that happened and was completely besides himself, hence the punching of trees and the like. I couldn't control him anymore, which is why I asked for the officer, who was trying to help me get him into the hotel room up until the groom started yelling, "Take me to jail. Take me to jail," in the middle of the lobby. You just can't reason with drunk people once they get going. So yes, the story says slammed, head into sidewalk, which is true, but y'all's imaginations are going wild. My second cousin got married in Vermont in the springtime, and the weather report called for chance of showers. As a result, they rented a huge circus-sized tent to put up covering the entire meadow they were going to have the reception in. It easily covered all 80 attendees and tables and chairs. It was massive. The meadow was also next to a pond, which will come into play a little later. Their ceremony beforehand was in a church about 2 miles away. The bride arrived via motorcycle as her dad was in the local Harley-Davidson club. During the ceremony at the church, it started to rain outside. Just a drizzle, no big deal. The bride and groom hopped on to the backs of their motorcycle escorts Harleys and rode off to the reception venue. About a minute after they started off, the light drizzle turned into full-on tropical storm winds with sleet and hail. They did not turn back, but rode through the storm to the venue. When the rest of us arrived, we found quite a scene. The tent had come off of its moorings. The groom and groomsmen all had their shirts off and were wrestling the tent back into place. The bride was completely soaked through her white dress and was covered in all of the groomsmen's jackets while she waited for her change of clothes to arrive. She was actually very calm and cool the whole time, even laughed it up a bit. She's a pretty rad chick. The wind was blowing so much that the pond had 2-foot waves crashing over its edge and splashing one of the tables near the bridesmaids. The rest of the guests and I all ran up to help with the tent, and just as we were getting it back in place, the wind gusted in the opposite direction and literally blew one of the bridesmaids into the pond. So things did not go as planned. The bride and groom, however, remained jovial the entire time. They were terrific and never stopped smiling. The wind died down about 20 minutes later, and we were able to have the reception, with the only downside being that there was about an inch of water throughout the meadow for a while. Everyone got drenched, but we all had a good time, and 2 beautiful people got married. My dad has vintage and veteran cars. When I was younger, he used to do some weddings with them. I loved clearing out the confetti from the car when he'd get home. One week he arrived back, and there was no confetti in the car. On the way to the church, the bride changed her mind, and instead of taking her and her father to church, they asked if he could drop them at the local zoo, as it's her favorite place. So he did, left them there in full wedding attire. They were going to get a taxi home when they were done. It was the days before mobile phones too, so I'm guessing PPL were waiting at the church for quite a while. Edit veteran cars are made before 1919 vintage, 1919 to 1930, in the UK that is. Also, I've just called my dad to ask him if he remembers this, and he seems to think, from what he could overhear, that she was only getting married because she was pregnant and thought she had to, was early 80s. He also told me he did 2 weddings where the groom never showed up. I was a groomsman in a wedding where the chapel was in the middle of a golf course. To get to the chapel, you have to take an elevator down from the clubhouse. If you live in Missouri, you might know I'm talking about Big Cedar Lodge. So wedding time rolls around, and all the groomsmen had spent the day drinking at the clubhouse. I had about 7 beers and I drank the least. Everyone is ready to go, but we're running a bit late. We take the elevator down, and it gets stuck between floors. 10 groomsmen and a groom are now stuck in a standard-sized elevator. We call for help, and the person answering tells us the mechanic has gone home, so it will be some time. One of the groomsmen is claustrophobic, and does not handle this news well. After about an hour of standing shoulder to shoulder in a controlled panic, we all really fucking have to pee. My best friend had an empty flask and pissed in it and filled it to the brim. It was really bad vibes in that elevator. Finally, the mechanic comes and does his magic, and we get to the floor of the golf course. We sprint across the golf course to get to the bathroom. We're about an hour late at this point. As we're sprinting across, the groom gets struck in the fucking head by an errant golf ball, screams and plops to the ground. He's laying on the ground dazed with a bloody head. We call his dad, who comes running over from the chapel. Around this time, the golfer who hit the ball drives over in his cart. He says, "You okay?" and fucking drives off, leaving 11 dudes drunk, and one we will later find out has a cranial hemorrhage. Dad runs over, not acknowledging us, and helps his son walk to his car and drives him to the emergency room. The wedding was canceled. Just to add, they got married at the same spot a couple months later, and everything went swimmingly. We did not drink as much the day of the wedding, and we avoided the elevator. From what I heard, it was an incredibly urgent ER visit for the groom, but he made it in time for there not to be any permanent neurological damage or some shit. I have not heard if they found the golfer. It didn't ruin the wedding or marriage, but it came close. An English guy marrying an Irish girl in Ireland. The wedding guests are comprised mostly of her family, including family from Northern Ireland, the nationalist, Republican parts, and his English friends and family. The wedding part goes off fine. Very romantic. Nice ceremony. But then at the reception, the time comes for speeches. Specifically the best man speech. The best man is a particularly red-faced, Brexit-voting English man. He proceeds to make the most insensitive, offensive speech, filled with jokes about recolonizing Ireland one woman at a time, about how the stag party had been a Good Friday, but the hangover was so bad it led to a Bloody Sunday. You get the idea. He winds up the speech by making a comment about how the speeches have gone on so long that it's like the guests are on hunger strike. Throughout all of this, the English groom and his friends and family were laughing. They thought it was funny. Her Irish family were all fuming. I was there as the plus one of the bride's cousins. It was aggressively awkward, and a lot of her cousins and uncles just refused to mingle with the groom's family at all. I'm no longer in touch with the guy who took me, so I don't know how the marriage is going. The bride was very kind, and despite his best man speech, the groom seemed like a nice enough guy. Back in my youth, I was a wedding photographer, so sit down and let me regale you with the worst wedding I ever shot. The groom was a childhood friend of mine who grew up one block over. Our parents knew each other and liked each other, but he was a bit of a douchebag as a kid, so we lost touch about the start of puberty. The day I got the call about the wedding, I was 28, so I hadn't seen the guy in 15 years at least. My mom was the caller, and she asked me to actually be in his wedding party. I told her the obvious, that I didn't much like the guy back then. We hadn't even spoken in a decade and a half, and I really didn't think that meant I was good for his wedding party. My mom told me that he hadn't had literally any friends over the years, so this would be a personal favor to her and to his mom. As part of the favor, my mom and I would do the photography of the wedding as our wedding gift. Reluctantly, I agreed. So, I go over to meet everyone after all this time, and within seconds I realize why I'm being asked for the favor. The friend hasn't brushed his teeth in years, and they are one solid mass. His bride is massively overweight and overbearing beyond belief. I suck it up, do my best, but the 4 months leading in are a nightmare. But then the wedding happens, and after the ceremony, which was actually nice, the bride decides literally out of the blue that she wants to have a white limo take her to the Hilton. It's June, there's no limos to be had, the Hilton is booked, but the best man, the groom's older brother, is furiously trying to find something and pay for it on his credit card because the bride is in full meltdown mode. In a fury, she rips her headpiece out, taking about 1/3 of her hair with it, and storms into the back room of the hall. The groom says he's going to try and talk her down, and goes back there with her. A few minutes later, the double doors of the back room slam open, and he comes running out, with a butcher knife through his palm. He's streaming blood and screaming. She tackles him from behind, yanks the knife out of his hand, oh that sound, and looks like she's going to stab him to death in front of the entire assembly. The best man and I both tackle her at once, and we're both grown men, but she's a total hellcat. The groom slips out, gets out of the hall, and runs to his car, but she also squirms free after biting the best man, and is maybe 30s behind the groom. He's just backed out, and as he puts it into drive, she leaps on the hood and grabs the wipers. He guns it, and as he bottoms out on the exit of the parking lot and yanks the wheel, she rolls off into the street and drills the far curb. As we run up to her, she's scratched all to hell, and she's bawling. The wedding got annulled the next day. Turns out she'd been psychotic several times during her adolescence and adulthood, and was on a bevy of pills every day. She decided on her own not to take her meds on her wedding day, because she wanted to be totally clear for the ceremony. Bad decision. For the many asking about the groom's teeth, he had so much plaque between them there were no spaces between his teeth. If you got close you could see the slight difference in color, and see where tooth ended and plaque began, but from further than a couple of feet away they looked solid. The whole family looked like stereotypical trailer trash, i.e. big 1980s mullets, run-down vehicles, etc. I went to a wedding where the groom had dated the same girl for like 6 years, and we all loved her. They broke up, and he married his jump-off piece like 6 months later. When people got the invite, they glanced at it and assumed he was marrying the long-term girlfriend, got to the chapel, and were like, who the fuck is this? It was an insanely expensive wedding with probably 200 people, but basically not everyone was treated the same. I found out at the reception that only some people were given +1s. I wasn't one of them, so my then fiancé had to stay at home while I went to this wedding where I knew absolutely no one. I was okay with it because I thought it was a small wedding, but then I got there and started talking to people, and we realized some folks were allowed to bring dates and others weren't. Awkward. The bartender spent the entire reception trying to hit on the groom's 14-year-old sister by plying her with alcohol, and I had assigned seating at a table full of the groom's douchebag college brothers. Just to top it off, They did the whole take pictures between the ceremony and the reception thing, which is fine, except it took 4 hours and they didn't serve any food until the wedding party arrived. They were split within a year, or two anyway. Good people, don't get me wrong, but holy shit, that was a bad wedding. My ex-SIL's wedding. She was getting married to a guy she met on FB. Her family did not approve because he was black/Japanese and she was white. His family didn't like it either, but everyone just went along with it and put on happy faces. I was married to her brother, and we were really young and dumb, and were fighting. We were both in the wedding though, but at the wedding when it was time to walk my then drunk husband yells, "I'm not walking down the aisle with that bitch again, I already made that mistake once." And I was so embarrassed and hurt. I wound up paired with one of the groom's friends. Well, it became the talk of the wedding, and everyone was just in the shittiest moods. Ceremony comes and everyone is extremely drunk, and my ex-SIL couldn't find her groom anywhere. I was still very upset over what my then husband had said, and was trying to lay low because of it. The guy I had walked with came over, and just talked to me, and cheered me up a bit. The groom was found, with some girl that came with one of his cousins, making out behind the building. All the anger the bride felt towards her groom was then passed to me, because somehow everything going wrong was somehow my fault. So it ended in a huge argument. The bride and groom split 2 months later, but not before she moved 6 states away with him, and got pregnant, and caught him fucking their neighbor's wife. I left my husband, and actually wound up with the guy I walked with in the wedding. The bride's now been a single mom for 7 years, and the groom just got out of jail for armed robbery. My ex-husband remarried, and is with a real complete bitch. I have been with the guy I walked with 8 years next month, and we have 2 kids together, so at least for me, the wedding led to happier times. So embarrassingly enough, I was dating this girl who asked me to go to her ex's wedding. We dated for a handful months prior, and asking me to go to a wedding together felt like a serious commitment. So I accepted, planned for the week off work, and we went all out for this wedding. Half the time we were trying to enjoy our stay together, she was missing. Fast forward, reception comes up, she makes a scene in the most utterly unstable, mentally sick way in front of children, the groom, the bride, absolutely everyone, and says out loud, "I'm still in love with you. We literally have been fucking for the past 2 days since we've seen each other." She quickly gets escorted out. The bride is clearly upset, and everyone goes about their business. But as soon as I leave this woman that I fly 2.5 hours with starts ruining the hall and everything, getting so upset on her way out. It was so embarrassing. I figured she was telling the truth since she was missing the whole time, and am pretty sure that everyone during the whole thing assumed this was too crazy to be real. It felt so weird and awkward. I felt a lot of my time was wasted. Felt more frustration than I could imagine. But by the time I left, I was able to leave early. I felt a heavy burden being lifted. Definitely regret not seeing her mentality before, but when you work so much and try to date at the same time, you have very little time to get to know some people. Time sort of flies by, and you end up dating for a few months. Fast forward a month or 2 later, she got together with the groom, and I'm pretty sure she has no regrets about wasting my time. She probably doesn't even feel bad about using me, or even ruining that man's marriage. This woman is seriously twisted. Concerning the going to an ex's wedding, there weren't any clear signs of dysfunctionality. She was a RN that literally made more money than me, and felt like she was just out of my league. She had a lot of patience with me, and being young adults hitting our 30s, it felt like a fairly healthy relationship of 2 adults. So seeing someone who was willing to see their ex's happiness was a sign of a healthy relationship with her peers in my eyes. Obviously, I'm not going to defend her actions. And being a mentally unhealthy human being that I just checked her FB just now, and yes, they are still together, and yes, they look like 2 people who just eloped. I have a George Soros wedding story for after my main story. Was a caterer at a really expensive wedding overlooking Rockefeller Center during the holiday season. 2 prominent New York Jewish families being bonded. Bride and groom got way too drunk and started physically fighting in front of everyone on the dance floor while screaming in each other's faces, like the bride trying to throw punches and the groom shoving her. The groom's mother was also pretty blasted and came back into the kitchen to blame us, the kitchen staff, for ruining her baby's big day because apparently one of the hors d'oeuvres came out a few minutes too late, and this was to blame for them getting too drunk and starting a public fist fight. I actually had permission to dip early from that shift, and was getting into the elevator right as the groom was screaming obscenities and had to held up / back by multiple members of the wedding party. I had to try really hard not to laugh earlier when his mother screamed in my face how we should feel ashamed and how she wasn't going to pay a penny. As though hiring a team of 15 back-end chefs, 5 upfront party chefs, 2 catering managers, and a team of waitstaff was something you can totally pay for after the fact, after everyone already ate. I don't know what happened after I left, but I was pleased to leave when I did. Now for the liberal boogeyman story. I did some of the prep for George Soros' latest wedding, and while it wasn't ruined, there were a few mishaps that were hilarious. He imported a foreign team of chefs from the top Michelin-starred restaurant in Europe. They proceeded to get fucking hammered every night in NYC and could barely function the next day, or were at least nursing hangovers and half asleep for the first few hours they were there every morning. They were back to normal by the second half the day. This went on for weeks. Free vacation from Mr. Soros, as far as they were concerned. I was a lowly kitchen hand, and this big shot chef was nice to me though, so I thought he was rad. A lot of chefs are raging assholes, and this guy patiently taught me how to break down Alaskan king crab, when I admitted I had no experience with such a task stealth edit. You would be surprised how many chefs function while drunk on the job as a regular modus operandi. We had a few chefs who got sent home, and were well into the 6-figure mark a few times while I was there. Like work all day, drink all night, not go home, and come back to the kitchen at 6:30 a.m. and pass out in their offices. The Europeans didn't do this. They at least went home to their hotels before strolling in the next day. Alcoholism and other forms of drug abuse are real issues in that industry. Soros wanted all the herbs to be fresh, so he actually had us buy an entire room full of potted herbs and edible plants that I had to rotate and water for weeks leading up the wedding. None of that made it to the wedding despite the plants being in good condition. We gave them away to staff after the wedding. The funniest bit was that one of the main dishes were imported lobster tail, that I personally had to help prep for hours on end, and the staff forgot to cook it, so at the last minute the chef, the imported big shot who was hungover, decided that it was going to be served raw, and he was just going to play it off like it was his intention all along. Soros apparently complimented him on how he had never heard of that before, but that it was great, and this guy was a culinary genius or some shit. The weddings of the super rich are incredible wasteful. There was a team well north of 100 people for just one of the nights of the Soros bash, and that was just from our company, and that's not including all the people who actually prepped the food before the day of the wedding. People like me who spent literally 8 hours just breaking up Alaskan king crab with a cleaver while standing in a freezer. To all of those who are saying, yeah right, there is no way they forgot to cook the lobster tail, you probably don't understand just how much food was needed to be prepped. They had to dedicate an entire walk-in plus other facilities to just the prep for this one wedding. That's usually enough space to hold many weddings/functions worth of food. Imagine a large bedroom just filled literally to the ceiling with meat and veggies. It actually wasn't just one walk-in. It was different sections of multiple walk-ins, but the space added up to be at least one full walk-in. Even with a team of dozens of cooks, it can be hard to get everything out in time, even for a regular large wedding. Never mind a billionaire's wedding. We're not talking about, oh I forgot to heat up a platter of X, Y, Z with the sternos. We're talking about 100 plus plates of something. Even setting that up to be cooked is going to take some time. Never mind plating it and getting it ready at the same time as the other stuff it's supposed to come out with. Think of how many people fail at their regular Thanksgiving dinner, trying to get everything ready at the same time. Now imagine that you are managing a team of 100 plus people, and there is a fairly strict time window for each course and dozens of things to prepare. Even for a veteran head chef, this is not a walk in the park. I worked at a catering hall after college, and a night I call chaos at the dais will forever be in my mind. Nighttime, wedding, everything is going as planned. As captain, I took my post outside the kitchen doors during best man/maid of honor speeches. Best man comes up and starts giving his speech, and begins talking about how the bride really stepped up and changed her ways in order to land the groom. He acknowledged that it took a lot from her to get to where she needed to be. Thought it was weird, but the speech ended, the dancing started, I got back in the kitchen, and we began getting dinner served. I came out and see a huge crowd at the dais. I'm wondering what's going on when I start to see fists getting thrown, with the best man as the center point. My manager and a few guests picked him up and dragged him out the doors to the lobby, while his attackers were pulled back from family members. 15 minutes later, the groom took the mic on the dance floor, holding his wife's hand, and said that it was inevitable. Apparently the best man wasn't a fan of the bride, because she had a history of sleeping around. The groom had his uncle, a reverend, come up and say a blessing/perform an exorcism. Devil, leave this wedding in peace. I command you, devil, which was wild. The bride told the maitre d' to serve cake and wrap it up 2 hours early. The staff was pumped to get out so early, but fuck, I felt so bad for the bride. That night is ruined. Those relationships are ruined. This special moment is forever ruined. Weeks later, I met a guy from my other job who happens to frequent the restaurant bar attached to the catering hall. He goes, "Hey, what happened a few weeks ago?" It was like Friday night, and I'm pulling in, and there were like 5 people in wedding attire in the middle of the road, trying to calm some tall guy down. We had a fair number of unexpected surprises at my wedding. On the day of the wedding, we had the following adventures. I forgot the carefully made-up wedding programs and the bubbles at the hotel. My brother's girlfriend at the time, now wife, and my cousin went to the hotel to retrieve them. They got lost and caught in bad traffic and didn't make it back until the ceremony was over. There was a mix-up with the rings, and we almost didn't have them in hand by the time the priest called for them. They were in my wife's mom's purse at the back of the church. Thankfully we noticed in time, and my sister got them during the ceremony and handed them to the best man about 2 minutes before the priest asked for the rings. Between the wedding and reception, my wife got grease from the door of the antique rolls on her dress as we were getting out for pictures. My wife had an allergic reaction to the shrimp during the reception and broke out in hives all over her face. We had a couple doctors in the place, so we got us some Benadryl and an EpiPen for the honeymoon. In an effort to maximize honeymoon time, I was in the middle of my 3L year in law school. We got a 6 a.m. international flight to Cancun the day after our reception that ended at 12 o'clock. That meant we had to be there at least 2 hours early, and the airport was about an hour from home. We got less than 2 hours of sleep that night. It was not the rainy season, but it rained every day but the day we got there and the day we left. And through all this, my wife smiled and was positive and still views it as a perfect day. She will literally say to me, "Remember how perfect it was?" Even when she was sitting in the bridal suite covered in hives from the shrimp, she just didn't want people to fuss with her. She just wanted to go back out there and have fun and dance. As an aside, she had never really reacted that way to shrimp before. It has only happened a couple times since. The allergist tested her negative for shellfish allergies, but said some things trigger allergies you don't normally have, like stress or vigorous activities such as running or dancing. We have since noticed that if she does any type of active physical activity after eating shrimp, she will get hives. If she eats shrimp, she is okay. If she eats shrimp and then goes for a jog, she will have a reaction. Honestly, the most awkward experience of my life. My cousin who is white married a Chinese guy. His name was Mr. Wong. Really nice guy. My uncle Dave and my cousin can be very flashy, and my uncle wanted the best of everything for his little princess, as did my cousin. The Wongs wanted something a bit more simple and rustic, and at better value, but Uncle Dave insisted, so I heard. Everything was as top shelf as it could be, the venue, the meals, the number of guests. I thought it was all a bit much, but if Uncle Dave is paying for it, I suppose it's okay. Then Dave gets up for his father of bride speech, and starts thinking it's comedy hour for racist jokes. One after another. It was honestly impressive how many there were. I remember looking over at my auntie, who I am biologically related to, and she had her head buried in her hands. Honestly, I was the same. I don't remember many jokes because I was trying to focus on anything else, pretending to inspect the chandelier, the cornices, the ceiling rose, fucking anything. I just remember at one point Dave saying, "And the most important thing to remember in marriage is 2 Wongs don't make a W, H, ite." I looked over at the Wong family, and they were not impressed. The room was on edge after that. Quan, the groom, stands up for his speech, and this is something I will never forget. He gets up and says, "Thank you to Dave for the lovely planning of such a beautiful wedding, and more importantly, thank you to my father for paying for it all." You could hear everyone shuffle in their seats and cough in discomfort. Then he says, "Thank you to my groomsmen, especially my best man Michael, who fucked my wife last night. Thank you everyone for coming, but I think this wedding is over. Feel free to enjoy the drinks package, and have a great night." I met up with my parents, and we all got out of there as soon as possible. It honestly nearly turned into a war between 2 families. Random Chinese people who I did not know were just glowering at everyone associated with this family. It took me years to speak to either Dave or my cousin again, and I have never been more embarrassed in my life. Not a disaster, but this was my wife's and my wedding, still going strong almost 3 years later. It started when I woke up. I felt like I had the flu, vomiting, nausea, fever, etc. My wife-to-be stayed at her mom's. We were already living together, but wanted to make the wedding night special. My best man was going to drive with me to the reception hall to drop my car, and then head to the ceremony. It took all my energy just to get ready, but with his help it happened. Dropped my car just fine, and headed to the church. Stopped on the way for my stomach to declare a jihad on a gas station toilet. Nothing new for me, as I have ulcerative colitis. I would later realize that this was entirely due to my UC and stress. We make it to the church, and I'm trying to thank people for coming and get photos, but I'm looking more and more pale by the second. Anyone with UC or Crohn's will tell you, the blood draining leaves you utterly exhausted. Well, we get to the time where I'm supposed to stand at the altar. I tell the priest, I've got to get to a bathroom. He lets me use his personal one. I hope he wasn't too pissed with how bad I wrecked it. But the organizer had to tell my amazing bride-to-be that things were on hold for that. 100 people waiting for my bowels to finish evacuating. Lovely. I walk out, and he drills me with questions on if I'm drunk. This is about the time I piece together what's going on. I explain. He looks leery but lets it slide. Ceremony starts. The ring bearers, our nephews on both sides, about 3 to 4 while walk down. They see my stress. They both hug me. Tears roll. Still one of my favorite photos. She walks in. Holy shit. I forget everything. Even how to breathe. When she gets to me, first thing she says, "Are you okay? Do we need to get you to the hospital?" The woman who had her wedding delayed because I might be sick was willing to put this day on hold because of my stomach. Fuck, I'm lucky. We proceed with the ceremony. She knows what's up. She's seen it before. We go through a period of like 10 to 15 minutes of standing facing the altar. I think that's how long it was. Felt like eternity. Just as I'm about to faint from blood loss, she signals the priest to let us sit. We did. God bless that woman. Ceremony concludes. I'm handed a bottle of water as we are exiting the aisle. It's even in our photos. Who cares? The reception was great. Still felt awful and was in the bathroom about 50% of the time. Not an exaggeration. But we had a blast. Open bar and I didn't get to partake, lol. I think this was more of an internal struggle for the couple than entire wedding, but I am very close to the couple, so I saw/hear all of it. I don't think they even know how bad it was. It started a few months before the wedding even started. We're Mexican and somewhat traditional, so the groom-to-be talked to the mother about marrying her daughter, since the bride's father had left them about 15 years ago for another woman, and he had another family with her. When the bride's father found out that the groom talked to the mother and not him, he brought it up to the bride, and that he wanted to talk to the groom. So the groom talks to him as a formality, and the father says he doesn't approve because he wasn't involved in their courtship. He literally hasn't been around for 15 years, and he says this. Anyway, the bride doesn't want a father-daughter dance because she doesn't know him that well anymore. So the father says that he'll go to the wedding, but not the reception in that case, after all the trouble he caused. Fast forward to the night before the wedding. The brother of the bride guilt trips her because he's your father and he should be there and have the father-daughter dance, etc. The night before the wedding. So the next morning she's upset about it, and so is the groom, so we try to make the best of it, but obviously it's a pretty big reason to be upset. My wife and I are helping setting up the reception hall in the morning. The maid of honor and a bridesmaid said they would bring in cupcakes for dessert. They bring some that are still in the muffin tray with no decoration. They just drop them off. My wife, who has never decorated cupcakes before, and a friend start doing them because the other two just leave. I'm helping with the decorations with the groom's family, but they have no idea what they're doing. Mexican decorations are completely different from what you would see in the States. It takes about 2 hours for everyone to get the things on the tables and they leave. I used to do catering and know about decorating tables, so I grab a friend and tell him to copy one of the tables I set up. I ran late to the wedding itself because of this. After the wedding, the bridal party leaves to take pictures. The photographer had told them about a park that was nice where they could take pictures. She couldn't find the park. My brother, one of the groomsmen, tells me that they were driving around for about 45 minutes looking for it. Meanwhile, the mother of the groom calls the groom to tell him that all the guests are at the reception hall and are hungry and that they should be there by now. The photographer chooses another park in the area to just take the pictures. Side note: the photographer went to school for marketing photography, so the pictures weren't exactly wedding photo material. While they're finding the second park, the best man, the groom's brother, gets frustrated with driving around so much and leaves them and goes to the reception hall. So the pictures don't end up having the bridal party because they thought it would be weird without him. On the way back, my brother's car starts smoking. Luckily, my brother just tells them to leave it and he'll deal with it later. When they get to the reception hall, the groom's mother gets upset with her son because they're late and family drove so far for this, and why would you make the wait, etc. Anyway, they ignore it and just start the reception. The DJ plays the wrong first dance. Apparently he didn't save/download it because he forgot, so just played the most romantic song he had. Family of the groom want to take pictures with the family obviously, but they can't find the groom's brother anywhere. He finally shows up after about an hour and a half. Turns out he went to another guy's party because he told him he would make an appearance. He did this on the day of his brother's wedding. Better yet, after about 2 hours into the reception, the maid of honor and a bridesman ask the bride if it's okay if they leave to go to the other guy's party. The bride is very level-headed and doesn't want to make a scene, so tells them it's fine. Mexicans will know that a party will never end before midnight. About 75 to 80% of the people were gone by 8:30. The entire place was clean and everyone out by 9:30. So that's bad. Afterwards, the new couple and my wife and I think it would be funny and maybe salvage the night by showing up at a restaurant with the bride's wedding dress and see what reaction people will give. The groom's brother asks him if he can spot him since he had spent all his money on the family that was visiting. In the end, a lot of people ended up going to the restaurant we said we were going to show up at, but the bride and groom, my wife and I and 2 other friends ended up just going to their apartment, had ice cream and pizza, and watched a movie. The saddest part was while everyone had left to the restaurant, the 6 friends that ended up going to the couple's apartment were hanging outside the reception hall, just talking while the family was loading up their presents. The bride said that those 15 minutes talking was the best part of the night. A friend of mine went to attend a wedding in Italy. Everyone was flown out for it a few days before, and the plan was to have a sort of joint bachelor/bachelorette party where the groom and bride would split up then reconnect back at the hotel. So the bride goes out to party with her friends, and it comes to about midnight when she returns to the hotel. She heads up to the hotel room she was sharing with her husband-to-be, puts the card in the door, and walks in to find her husband sitting on the edge of their bed, suckling on his own mother's breast. Apparently it was a nervous habit he's had since he was a child, where he suckles on his mother's nipple whenever he's extremely anxious. I imagine from not being properly weaned off breastfeeding. The wife had no idea about this habit, obviously. Apparently he had been very nervous about the wedding, so his mother had decided to comfort him in their room. The bride went apeshit, stormed out the room, screaming and crying, told everyone she came across that the wedding was off and exactly what she'd just seen. By the next morning, the damage was done and the wedding was called off. Everyone got flights home. Husband didn't show his face around anyone for a long time after. I know this reads like that Biddyb sketch from Little Britain, but both my friend and his partner confirm it to be absolutely true. Probably the most mental story I ever heard.